Alright gang, listen up. This is rhythm counting here for the basics. Level 1. At the very beginning, we label every beat with a number. We've got 3 rules of rhythm counting. The first one, we'll just put them right up here so we can refer back to them. Every measure begins with 1. So, the first thing in every measure is always going to be called 1. If we're down here, that's the first thing in the measure, so we label it 1. Rule number 2. Every note or rest, either one, is dependent upon what comes before it. Basically, that's a fancy way of saying this second thing in the measure depends on what happens before that. We're going to get back to that one in a sec. Rule number 3. Rests get parentheses. Right now we don't have any parentheses, so we'll come back to that one in a second too. So let's look at this first measure. We got the measures up here so you can see which measure I'm talking about. Measure 1, there's the bar line. Measure 2, there's the bar line. If you're used to 5 staff lines, don't worry about it. We don't have to talk about pitch. We don't have to talk about the highness or the lowness of the music right now. So we're just talking about rhythm. We only need 1 staff line here. So rule number 1, every measure begins with 1. That's why we've called this first thing, whatever it happens to be here, beat 1. Now, what is this first thing called? As you probably know, that's a quarter note. A quarter note gets 1 beat. So it takes up all of beat 1, but it doesn't take up any more of beat 1. Rule number 2 is every note or rest is dependent upon what comes before it. Because this is a quarter note, that means we have to call the next one beat 2. This may be pretty simple for most of you. You can label 4 quarter notes very quickly in the measure. Beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, and beat 4. But the reason that we call each of these is because each of these quarter notes are only worth 1 beat. They get 1 tap, they're worth 1 beat, and therefore they're each 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 beat in the measure. Now we get to the end of the bar, we get to the end of the measure, we see a bar line there. It's a good thing to go back and check to make sure, do we have 4 complete beats if we're supposed to according to our time signature here. 1, 2, 3, 4, yes we do. But let's go on and see what happens when we look at this measure number 2. Same rules apply. Oh, one more thing before we go on. We didn't have any rest in that measure, so we don't have to talk about the rule number 3 here. Same thing goes on here. Measure 2. Rule number 1. Every measure begins with 1. No problem. We call that first note beat 1. Now, this isn't a quarter note anymore. Rule number 2 says every note or rest is dependent upon what comes before it. This is a half note, which as we know, half notes get 2 beats. So that takes up all of beat 1, but it also takes up beat 2. So we can't call this beat 2 here, because beat 2 is already taken up with the first half note. We have to call this beat 3. Therefore, that is a half note, and that also takes up 2 beats. It will take up all of beat 3. It begins on beat 3, and then it also takes up all of beat 4. We have no rests in here, so we don't have to worry about that either. Do we have 4 complete beats in this measure? 1, 2, second half of that half note, 3, 4, second half of that half note. Yes, we do. We must be correct there. Let's move on. Half note. Rule number 1. Every measure begins with 1. Now, this is a half note. It takes up all of beat 1 and all of beat 2. So even though this is a quarter note, we still call it 3, just like we call this 3. That's a half note. This is a quarter note. It's still beat 3. And the reason is This is a half note, it's taken up 1 and 2. This was a half note, it took up 1 and 2. So this is also beat 3. Now this is a quarter note, so we're not done with the measure yet. That's only one beat. This becomes beat 4. Do we have 4 complete beats here? 1, 2 is the second half of the half note, beat 3, and beat 4. Yes, we do. Rule number 1. Every measure begins with 1. This is a quarter note, therefore this second note is beat 2. This is a quarter note, therefore whatever comes after it is the very next beat, beat 3. But where's beat 4? Oh, it's in the second half of the half note. Easy, we have 4 beats here. Here is a whole note. What's rule number 1? There, do we have 4 complete beats in this measure? Yes, because a whole note is worth 4 beats. But we label it 1. Now, if you want to put a little 2, 3, 4 to help you out, that's perfectly fine. If you want to put a little over on here in measure 3, if you want to put a little 1, 2 above that, that's fine too. But really, it starts on beat 1, and that's why we're calling it beat 1. Here we have measure 6. Rule number 1. Start on 1. This is a quarter note, and therefore this has to be beat 2. This confuses a few people. What comes next? A lot of people will put 3 here and think they're done. Actually, this half note takes up all of beat 2 and all of beat 3. So therefore, what is next? Beat 4. That's a quarter note. We're finished with the measure. We have 4 complete beats here. Now, we haven't talked about rule number 3, rest, skip, parentheses. But basically, it is the same system, except when you reach a rest, you're going to put parentheses around it instead of just the number. So, measure 7 down here. Rule number 1. Beat 1. Next. This is beat 2, but we're going to put parentheses around it because it's a rest. This is a quarter rest, so that's all of beat 2. Next, we're going to put a 3 there, and then again, parentheses around it. That's beat 4. Same way happens over here. This is a half note, beat 1. Oh, wait a minute. This is a half note, so that's beat 1 and beat 2. So after that, this has to be beat 3. Of course, parentheses because it's a rest. And there we go. That is a half rest, so it's beat 3 and beat 4. Rule number 1. Every measure begins with 1. There is beat 1 and beat 2 because that's a half note. So after the half note, we must go on to beat 3. Then we've got a quarter note after this. This was a quarter rest, takes up all of beat 3. And we got a quarter note, we call that beat 4. 4 complete beats here. 1, 2 is the second half of the half note. Beat 3 is the quarter rest. Beat 4 is the quarter note at the end of the measure. 1. This becomes beat 2 with parentheses, of course, because it's a rest. This is beat 3 and beat 4 there. Beginning of the measure, 1. This is beat 2. This becomes beat 3 with parentheses because it's a rest. And this is beat 4. And then this measure 12 up here looks exactly like 6, so I'm going to change that and see if we can look at that. Here we have a rest starting at the beginning of the measure, but same rule applies. Every measure begins with 1, so that is going to be called 1. However, it does have parentheses around it because it's a rest. That is a quarter rest. It takes up 1 beat, so therefore this begins on beat 2. This is a half note here. It takes up all of beat 2 and beat 3. Therefore, this quarter rest here will be parentheses 4. That is your level 1 for rhythm counting.